In 1969, Chrysler unveiled something that would change American automotive history forever. 3 carburetors, 7.4 liters of displacement, and a power output so absurd that within just a few years, every major manufacturer in America would conspire to kill it. This is the story of the Mopar 446-pack, the engine that was so dominant, so utterly devastating to the competition, that it sparked what historians now call the muscle car wars and led to the eventual banning of an entire class of automobiles. Along the way, we'll encounter corporate espionage, backroom deals, a handful of engineers who didn't know when to quit, and a conspiracy that brought the golden age of American muscle to its knees. So let us begin. But first, how did we get here? What was the automotive landscape that made the six-pack not just possible, but necessary? Now, to understand why the 446-pack matters, you have to understand what American car culture looked like in the mid-1960s. See, the muscle car era didn't just happen overnight. It was a slow burn that started with the 1964 Pontiac GTO, a car that basically said, what if we took a mid-size body and stuffed the biggest engine we could find into it? The formula was simple: big engine, relatively small car, affordable price, and the American public absolutely ate it up. By 1966, every major manufacturer was in the game. Ford had the Fairlane GT, Chevrolet had the Chevelle SS, Dodge and Plymouth, both under the Chrysler umbrella, had their own entries. And here's the thing, it became an arms race, not a metaphorical one, a literal corporate-sanctioned war where the only metric that mattered was horsepower. More power meant more sales meant more bragging rights, and more bragging rights meant you got to run ads saying your car was the fastest thing on 4 wheels. The problem was, by 1968, everyone had kind of hit a wall. The big block engines were getting as large as they could reasonably get. Chevrolet had their 427. Ford had the 428 Cobra Jet. Chrysler had the 440 Magnum. All of them were hovering around 400 horsepower, give or take. And all of them were facing the same limitation. You could only flow so much air and fuel through a single 4-barrel carburetor. This is important. Keep this in mind because it becomes relevant later. The engineers at Chrysler weren't stupid. They knew the theoretical limits of their existing setup. They also knew that their competitors were facing the same constraints. So the question became, how do you break through? How do you find another 50, 60, maybe even 100 horsepower without completely redesigning the engine from scratch? The answer, as it turns out, was beautifully simple. You don't use 1 carburetor, you use 3. I mention this because the idea wasn't actually new. Multiple carburetor setups had been around for decades, mostly in racing applications. The famous Offenhauser engines that dominated Indianapolis for years used them. But nobody had really figured out how to make it work for a mass-production street car. The problem was always the same. Multiple carburetors were finicky, hard to tune, and unreliable. They were fine for a race car that had a team of mechanics constantly adjusting them. They were not fine for a car that some guy in Des Moines was going to drive to work every day. But anyway, back to Chrysler. In late 1968, a team of engineers started working on what would become the six-pack system. The concept was straightforward. You take the existing 440 cubic inch V8 and replace the single 4-barrel carburetor with 3 2-barrel carburetors mounted on a special aluminum intake manifold. The center carburetor handles normal driving. The 2 outboard carburetors only kick in under heavy throttle. It was essentially a way to have your cake and eat it too. Fuel efficiency and smooth operation for daily driving. Absolutely insane power when you put your foot down. The engineering challenges were significant. Getting the 3 carburetors to work in harmony required precise calibration. The linkage system that activated the outboard carburetors had to be tuned so they opened at exactly the right moment. Too early, and the engine would stumble. Too late, and you'd lose the power advantage. The intake manifold had to be designed to ensure equal fuel distribution to all 8 cylinders, and the whole thing had to be reliable enough that dealers wouldn't be flooded with warranty claims. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The engineers didn't just solve these problems, they solved them so well that the resulting engine was actually more powerful than anyone expected. The official factory rating for the 446-pack was 390 horsepower. But anyone who actually tested one knew that number was a lie. A deliberate understatement designed to keep insurance companies and the government from asking too many questions. Real dyno tests showed the 6-pack producing well over 400 horsepower at the flywheel. Some estimates put it closer to 430. Think about that for a moment. In an era when most family sedans were producing maybe 150 horsepower, Chrysler was selling cars to teenagers and young men that made nearly 3 times that much. And they were selling them cheap. A 1969 Plymouth Roadrunner with the 6-pack option cost around $3,500. Adjusted for inflation, that's maybe $25,000 in today's money. For a car that could run the quarter mile in the low 13-second range right off the showroom floor. The automotive press went absolutely insane. Car and Driver called it the most powerful engine option available in an American passenger car. Motor Trend ran a test and clocked a 0 to 60 time of 5.8 seconds, which doesn't sound that impressive today, but was absolutely mind-blowing in 1969. Hot Rod Magazine did a feature where they stripped a Roadrunner down to bare essentials and ran it at the drag strip. They recorded a 12.9-second quarter mile at 108 miles per hour from a car you could buy at your local Dodge dealer. The competition noticed, and they were not happy about it. See, the problem with the 6-pack wasn't just that it was fast, it was that it was fast and affordable and reliable. Ford had their 428 Super Cobra jet, but it was expensive and temperamental. Chevrolet had the LS6 454, but it wouldn't arrive until 1970. General Motors was still operating under an internal policy that prohibited engines larger than 400 cubic inches in intermediate-sized cars, a policy they were desperately trying to get around. And here was Chrysler, just blowing past everyone with a setup that cost maybe $200 more than the standard 440. The muscle car wars, as they came to be known, had entered a new phase, and Chrysler was winning. But we'll get to that. First, let's talk about what made the 6-pack technically special, because honestly, this is kind of fascinating from an engineering perspective. The 3 carburetors used on the 6-pack were Holley 2300 series 2 barrels. The center carburetor was a 350 CFM unit that handled all the light load and cruise conditions. The 2 outboard carburetors were larger, 500 CFM each, and they sat there doing nothing until you pushed the throttle past a certain point. At about 50% throttle opening, a progressive linkage mechanism would begin opening the outboard carbs. By the time you had the pedal on the floor, all 3 carburetors were flowing wide open, dumping an absolutely ridiculous amount of fuel and air into the engine. The intake manifold was a work of art. Cast from aluminum to save weight, it featured an open plenum design that allowed all 3 carburetors to feed into a common chamber before the air-fuel mixture was distributed to the individual runners. This meant that at high RPM, the engine could breathe like nothing else on the market. The original 440 Magnum, with its single 4-barrel, was already a strong performer. The 6-pack version gained an additional 40 to 50 horsepower just from the improved breathing. And then there was the camshaft. The 6-pack engines received a more aggressive cam profile than the standard 440. More lift, more duration, more overlap. This hurt low-end torque slightly, but dramatically improved the engine's ability to make power at higher RPM. Combined with the improved breathing from the triple-carburetor setup, it created an engine that just kept pulling harder and harder as the tachometer needle climbed. I should mention the exhaust system, too. The six-pack cars came with larger diameter exhaust manifolds and a less restrictive dual exhaust setup. Every aspect of the engine was optimized for flow. Air in, exhaust out, as quickly as possible. The result was an engine that felt unlike anything else on the market. Contemporary reviews all commented on the same thing. The six-pack had a personality. At low speeds it was actually pretty docile. The center carburetor handled everything, and the car drove like any other big block Mopar. But push the throttle past that magic threshold, and the outboard carburetors would snap open, and suddenly you were holding onto the steering wheel for dear life as the rear tires broke loose and the world turned into a blur. If you've made it this far, you're probably into this kind of stuff. Quick question, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. And hey, subscribe if you haven't. We do this every week. All right, here's where the story takes a darker turn. Because the six-pack's dominance didn't go unnoticed, and the people who noticed weren't just competitors. They were insurance companies, safety advocates, and government regulators. By 1970, the muscle car market had become a genuine cultural phenomenon. Young people were buying these cars by the hundreds of thousands, and they were crashing them too. Accident rates among drivers under 25 were skyrocketing. Insurance claims were going through the roof. And the insurance industry, which had initially been happy to write policies for these cars at modest premiums, suddenly realized they were bleeding money. The backlash started slowly. Insurance companies began raising rates on high-performance vehicles. A young driver who wanted to insure a six-pack Roadrunner might find himself paying premiums that were half the purchase price of the car itself. This didn't kill sales immediately, but it started to put pressure on the market. Then came the environmental angle. The Clean Air Act of 1970 established the Environmental Protection Agency and gave it authority to regulate vehicle emissions. The muscle cars, with their massive engines and inefficient carburetors, were obvious targets. The six-pack setup, which essentially dumped raw fuel into the engine under acceleration, was about as far from emissions-friendly as you could get. And finally, there was the safety movement. Ralph Nader's book Unsafe at Any Speed had sparked a national conversation about automotive safety. While Nader's primary target had been the Chevrolet Corvair, the broader message resonated. Manufacturers were prioritizing performance and profit over the lives of consumers. The muscle cars, with their incredible power and often questionable handling, became symbols of corporate irresponsibility. Now here's what most people don't know. The manufacturers didn't just passively accept these pressures, they actively collaborated to bring the muscle car era to an end. I know that sounds like a conspiracy theory, but the evidence is actually pretty compelling. Internal memos from General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler all show executives discussing the muscle car problem in the late 1960s and early 1970s. The issue wasn't just regulatory pressure, it was that the horsepower wars had become mutually destructive. Each manufacturer was spending enormous sums developing ever more powerful engines, and the profits from those efforts were being eaten up by warranty claims, liability lawsuits, and the marketing costs of trying to outshout the competition. At some point, someone realized that everyone would be better off if the whole category just quietly went away. The timing is suspicious, honestly. In 1970, General Motors finally dropped its internal displacement limit, releasing the LS6 454 Chevelle. But almost immediately, they began detuning their engines for the 1971 model year, citing emissions requirements. Ford followed suit. And Chrysler, which had been winning the horsepower war with the six-pack and the 426 Hemi, also announced dramatic reductions in engine output. The official explanation was that new emissions regulations required the use of lower compression ratios and less aggressive cam profiles. And that's partly true, but the degree of the reductions went far beyond what regulations actually required. The 1971 six-pack, for example, was officially rated at 385 horsepower, under the new SAE net rating system, but independent tests showed it was actually making somewhere around 330, maybe 340 horsepower, a drop of nearly 100 horsepower from the 1969 version. What's interesting is that this happened across all three major manufacturers at almost exactly the same time. Coincidence? Maybe. But there's evidence that executives from the Big Three met multiple times during this period to discuss industry-wide challenges related to emissions and safety. No formal agreements were ever documented, at least none that have become public, but the pattern suggests coordination. By 1972, the muscle car era was effectively over. The six-pack option was discontinued after the 1971 model year. The 426 Hemi, Chrysler's ultimate performance engine, also disappeared. Ford killed the Boss 429 and the 428 Cobra Jet. GM neutered the LS6 into near irrelevance. The cars that remained wore the muscle car names, but delivered performance that was mediocre at best. And here's the thing that's really frustrating. The technology didn't go away. It was deliberately suppressed. When the EPA actually tested the emissions from detuned muscle car engines, they often found that the reductions in power hadn't actually improved emissions all that much. The real solution, catalytic converters and electronic fuel injection, was still years away. The power cuts were, in many ways, a symbolic gesture designed to appease regulators and insurers without actually solving the underlying problems. The manufacturers knew this. They had to know. Their own engineers had surely told them that cutting compression ratios and retarding ignition timing was a crude solution that sacrificed performance without proportionally reducing emissions. But they did it anyway, because it allowed them to point to horsepower numbers and say, "Look, we're being responsible now." Some historians have argued that this was actually a rational response to market conditions. The muscle car buyer demographic was shrinking. Insurance costs had priced many young people out of the market. The oil crisis of 1973 would soon make fuel-efficient cars more appealing. The manufacturers were simply reading the writing on the wall and pivoting to where they thought the market was going. But that doesn't explain the coordination. It doesn't explain why all three manufacturers made essentially the same decisions at essentially the same time. And it doesn't explain why the six-pack specifically was targeted for elimination rather than being adapted to meet emissions requirements. The triple-carburetor setup could have been tuned for cleaner combustion. Lean burn technology was already being developed. If Chrysler had wanted to save the six-pack, they probably could have. They didn't want to. None of them did. The muscle car wars had become too expensive, too dangerous, and too unpredictable. Better to call a truce, blame the government, and move on to more profitable segments. So what happened to the six-pack cars themselves, the ones that were already built, already sold, already out there in garages and driveways across America? They became legends. The thing about a machine that was killed before its time is that it takes on an almost mythological quality. The six-pack cars, especially the 1969 and 1970 models, became some of the most sought-after collectibles in automotive history. People who had bought them knew and actually driven them, put miles on them, raced them at drag strips on weekend nights, suddenly found themselves sitting on appreciating assets. By the late 1970s, when it became clear that muscle cars weren't coming back anytime soon, the Survivor six-packs started changing hands for serious money. By the 1980s, they were firmly established as collector items. By the 1990s, Concours quality examples were selling for six figures. Today, a documented numbers-matching 1970 Plymouth Roadrunner with the 446-pack and a four-speed manual transmission might fetch $300,000 or more at auction. That's a car that cost $3,500 new. And what of the engineers who created it? Most of them went on to long careers at Chrysler, working on progressively less exciting projects as the company pivoted toward economy cars and minivans. A few wrote memoirs or gave interviews in which they expressed regret about what might have been. The general sentiment was one of pride mixed with frustration, pride that they had created something truly special, frustration that corporate and regulatory forces had killed it before it had a chance to fully evolve. One engineer, whose name I won't mention because he requested anonymity in subsequent interviews, described the six-pack development process as the most fun I ever had at work. He also described its cancellation as the day the music died. He said he knew even then that they were witnessing the end of an era, not just for Chrysler, but for the entire American automobile industry. The muscle car ban, as it came to be called informally, wasn't technically a ban at all. No law was passed that prohibited high-performance vehicles. The manufacturers simply chose, collectively and more or less simultaneously, to stop making them. The regulatory pressure provided convenient cover. The insurance industry pressure provided financial incentive. And the backroom coordination, whether formal or informal, provided assurance that no one manufacturer would gain an advantage by defecting from the arrangement. It was, in retrospect, a remarkably effective conspiracy. So effective that most people don't even think of it as a conspiracy. They think of it as a natural market evolution, a response to changing consumer preferences and regulatory requirements. But when you look at the timeline, when you look at the internal communications that have since become public, when you look at the way all three manufacturers moved in lockstep, it's hard to escape the conclusion that something coordinated was happening. The six-pack was the ultimate expression of a philosophy that said more power is always better, that the customer should have access to as much performance as engineering could provide, that cars should be exciting and dangerous and alive. That philosophy died in 1971, and it wouldn't really return until the modern era, when electronic controls and safety systems finally made it possible to build insanely powerful cars that didn't regularly kill their drivers. Would the muscle car era have ended anyway? Probably. The oil crisis alone might have been enough to shift consumer preferences. But it would have ended differently, more gradually, with more innovation rather than more restriction. The six-pack might have evolved into something even more remarkable, a fuel-injected version perhaps, or a turbocharged variant. We'll never know. What we do know is that for a brief, glorious moment in American automotive history, you could walk into a Dodge or Plymouth dealer with less than $4,000 and drive away in a car that was faster than almost anything else on the road. A car with 3 carburetors and an absolutely absurd amount of power, a car that made insurance companies tremble and safety advocates clutch their pearls. A car that was so dominant, so utterly without compromise, that the entire industry had to conspire to kill it. And that is the story of the Mopar 446-pack. Subscribe if you want more, and let me know in the comments, did you know about the muscle car conspiracy before this? Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.